Yes. If that's all you wanted to know, then you're done. You don't have to watch this video. If you want to know why they're connected, then continue watching because I'm about to explain it as best as I can because this is something that's been going on for like however many, I think it's like what, going on 1.5, 2 years now. There's been connections like ever since the travelers were introduced on Twitter, basically. There's been connections, but there's been constant deniers ever since Genshin exploded. It's been just a nightmare of elitists arguing with each other, and I just want to explain it as best I could in video form because I wanted to talk about it. So this video is really only going to contain spoilers for Genshin. I'm not going to go too much into the story of Honkai, but I will cover everything that's relevant to this specifically because I want more people to go play Honkai because it's a good game and you should play it. As for Genshin, the Honkai elitists don't shit all over this video for no reason. The two are connected whether you like it or not. If you have a problem with your niche little game being involved with Genshin, that's on you, not my problem. So the first thing I wanted to explain before I really head into this is the concept of the multiverse, specifically as it's covered in Honkai, because Genshin doesn't really devolve into that. So in Honkai Impact 3rd, there's the imaginary tree and the Sea of Quanta. Basically, they're abstract concepts. Specifically, the imaginary tree is an abstract concept that is kind of similar to Yggdrasil in a way, like the world tree. Basically, it sprouts branches, and those branches are world lines or timelines. And every single bud or leaf on the tree is its own universe. As long as a universe is connected to the imaginary tree, it's sustained evenly. Now, in Honkai Impact, just like how there's the real-life laws of gravity or entropy as universal constants, there's also Honkai. Basically, how Honkai works is the more civilization progresses, the more Honkai progresses, and Honkai manifests itself in plagues, diseases, infections, beasts, monsters, Herrschers, which are basically human manifestations of the Honkai. That's the easiest way I could explain it for now. I'll get into it later. But the main thing you need to know is that it's an established multiverse, and traveling through the Sea of Quanta or through imaginary space in the imaginary tree is how one would reach another universe. Basically, it's conceptually like the multi-layered M theory, dimensional realities up to 11 dimensions. It's the same thing, basically. So the biggest thing to canonically confirm that everything is connected between the two games is at the end of chapter 17 of Honkai's main story. In that chapter, Auto-Apocalypse sees different universes through the imaginary tree, and in that we get to see Dvalin. And this was confirmed in the Fallen Rosemary trailer for 4.2, that it was indeed Dvalin that Otto was seeing. So this on its own confirms that the two exist at least in the same multiverse. So the next thing canonically I wanted to talk about was the Travelers' introductions on Twitter. So as you know, or now it's called nowadays, drip marketing, when they tease a character for the first time, they tend to give a little introduction paragraph, explain it, whatever. When the Travelers were introduced, they were actually signed off on their introductions by a person known as KK. KK is the nickname of one of the Flame Chasers in Honkai, and without going into full detail on what that is just yet, all you really need to know is that because they signed off on it, it confirms that there's a connection between the Travelers and KK. One final thing that's not exactly canonical, but I think is really neat to look at, is the cinematic parallels between some of the cutscenes in Genshin and Honkai. I'll probably just put them somewhere on screen. I just think they look really cool, and that's pretty much all of it. So from here on out, some of this is more meta-level observations rather than canonical, and after that I'm gonna really get into speculation. So if all you wanted to know is that, then you're free to click off the video, I guess. If you want to keep watching, I would appreciate that. So the first thing I want to cover is the characters. Now, I know a lot of people seem to have this misconception that comparing the characters between the two games is wrong because they're different games and they shouldn't be compared, but if you've played Honkai Impact 3rd, you should know yourself that that's not how that works. As we've seen through different realities in Honkai Impact 3rd, that the same character can exist but in different forms. They're different characters, but they look the same, have the same voice actor, and they're similar in some ways. So almost like they're different incarnations of themselves. A good example of this would be Yae Kasumi and Yae Sakura. So you have Yae Sakura from the current era in our universe, and then you have Yae Kasumi in another universe where, you know, she becomes cyborg ninja. The reason I bring this up is because as of right now, there's 5 characters who look visually similar to characters in Honkai and share both the Japanese and Chinese voice actors of those characters. The reason I only say Chinese and Japanese voice actors is because, unlike Genshin, which has a Korean and English dub, Honkai only has a Japanese and Chinese dub, so I can't use that as a comparison. The first character is obviously Raiden A, sharing in voice actors an appearance to Raiden Mei, or in previous era, Dr. Mei. The second character is Yae Miko, who shares her voice actors with Yae Sakura, Sakura of the previous era, and then, of course, Yae Kasumi, as I mentioned before. The third character is the unknown god, who, as of right now, we don't know the name of, but I'm sure there's plenty of theories. I don't want to go into that right now. The point is, they look similar to and have the same voice actors as Kiana Kozlana. The fourth character, funnily enough, is actually Diona, who shares her voice actors with Hiko Kumaru, and, well, at first I was a bit hesitant on this one. They do share some visible similarities between the two of them, so take that as you will. And last but not least, the best character, Kamisato Ayato, shares his voice actors with the best character in Honkai Impact 3rd, Auto Apocalypse. Everyone just clicked off this video. So considering all those 5 characters, I think it's pretty safe to say that for most of them, they are, in MCU terms, variants of the characters from Honkai. The next thing I wanted to talk about was how the Herrschers in Honkai are similar to the Archons of Honkai. Now, the comparisons have been made a lot. In fact, just in the recent 4th anniversary for Honkai, they had an event where they asked what the Herrscher of Wind was, and the answer was either Wendy, which is the correct answer, or Venti, who's the Anemo Archon. So that covers that one already. The joke is apparent. They look almost identical. The only difference is one's a wind spirit and one's a girl in a wheelchair. As for Zhongli, the comparison is actually a bit hard because Zhongli does not look anything like the current era Herrscher of Stars. However, if we get into some theorizing, there is the Divine Key, the Void Archive, which, without explaining what that is, because that's going to take me absolutely forever, they can use the powers of the previous era's Herrschers. Now, at one point when fighting a user of the Void Archives, the user actually used these big pillars emerging from the ground, and if not destroyed in time during the boss fight, they would summon a giant meteor from the sky, which is remarkably similar to Zhongli's abilities in Genshin Impact. So I think from that it is at least somewhat reasonable to assume that the previous era's Herrscher of Rock does in some way have similarities to Zhongli. I already compared Raiden Mei and Raiden A. The comparison there is completely blatant and I shouldn't have to elaborate. Now, while we don't have the appearance of any of the other Archons in Genshin Impact, through the manga we do get the Muratans, who are descendants of Lady Murata, the Pyro Archon. Now, assuming that she's not dead already at this point, Lady Murata shares a name with Himiko Murata from Honkai Impact 3rd. While Himiko Murata doesn't actually become a Herrscher, in the previous era, a version of her, simply as Himiko, does become the Herrscher of Flame. So the comparison could be made there that most likely the Pyro Archon Lady Murata shares similarities with Himiko Murata. Now let's go a bit deeper into the rabbit hole. So to get into this, I'm gonna have to explain the difference between the previous era and the current era of Honkai Impact. Without going too far into spoilers, basically 50,000 years ago there was a super advanced civilization that was more advanced than the current human civilization, but they were destroyed by the Honkai for that very reason. At the time, the main organization fighting off the Honkai was Fire Moth, or the Moth who chased the flame. The heroes of the Fire Moth organization were the 13 Flame Chasers. Now, in charge of a project known only as Project Save, SAVE, were some of these flame chasers who were given the nickname of Pioneers. Now, there was 3 main projects in Project Save, but the only one that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about right now is Project Arc. Project Arc was a project in which they sent genome of humanity out into space in hopes of finding another world to inhabit. Now, a pretty popular theory is the theory that the travelers are indeed what Project Arc is, because we never get to see exactly what's involved with Project Arc, unlike the other 2 projects on the games in the manga. And Project Arc lost communication with Firemoth after it was sent out. So that's the only one that has left on a hanging plot thread. Going along with that, actually, is those exact Twitter introductions that I mentioned earlier. Now, interestingly enough, the introductions for the Travelers on Twitter sound a lot like they would have been involved in Project Ard, and that is as follows. Don't lose faith in that which you have lost. In this new world, you will never be alone. Where you leave your footprints, and where you have yet to stride, your new world will unfold before you. Welcome to a new world. The world you once knew was but dust, the wonders you knew but rubble. Though you should have your own world, and your own people, lamenting what is already lost. Going along with the fact that we know that Kikei is the name of a flame chaser, that leads credence to the fact that most likely the introduction for the Travelers is talking about the destruction of the previous era, which I'll expand more on that after this next crackpot theory. Now I wanted to get into good old Scaramouche. So first, before going into what Scaramouche says, I would like to first explain the mechanics of the law of Honkai testing universes. So as I mentioned before, Honkai is a universal law like entropy and gravity, hence the organization Honkai Anti-Entropy. The law of Honkai dictates that the more civilization progresses, the more Honkai attempts to end humanity. Now, when a universe is destroyed, it falls from the imaginary tree into the Sea of Quanta, becoming a bubble universe. Now, bubble universes are fragments of the universes they formerly were, after having succumbed to the Honkai. Because they are no longer connected to the imaginary tree, they no longer have a way to sustain their stability and energy, and will eventually succumb to entropy in the Sea of Quanta, fading from existence entirely. Now this is where I get into what Scaramouche said, that being,
the stars, the sky, it's all a gigantic hoax, a lie.
Now, I see a lot of people bring up that line specifically, but actually what I wanted to get into, involving the fact that Teyvat might be a bubbly universe, is actually these lines that he says to the Traveler in Act 3 of Chapter 2.
Eternity stretches things out over a long time, but each moment within it becomes all the more fragile, just like a bubble on the water. Beautiful for a moment, then total destruction.
So the guy who knows the truth about the world said that. We're fucked. And considering that the Travelers try to leave the world, if they are Project Art, considering the disaster of Conria was going on at the same time, the full-on cataclysm, and that along with that, it might have been a bubble universe that was on the verge of destroying itself, yeah, I would have tried to leave too. Now, the next thing I actually wanted to get into was Makoto's realm of consciousness. Now, as we know, the realm of consciousness is created. Now, the interesting thing that I wanted to get into is how, when Ye is describing it, she seems to describe it as if it exists in another space-time. But the most interesting thing is when she describes traveling to Makoto's realm of consciousness.
Everything is turbulent and disordered. If you try to force your way in, you could be swept away by a giant wave that sets you down in an unknown corner of space-time. Only a strong enough will can prevent you from being swallowed by the giant waves of abstract space. Only if you are strong enough can I deliver you to the right destination. It
almost sounds like she's describing the Traveler going through the Sea of Quanta to reach it, which is already actually an established thing, as the Pioneer Sue created his own bubble universe, which was also accessed through the Sea of Quanta. This further establishes the connection and also gives the possibility of the two interacting at some point or another. And actually, using Sue to segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about, that would be Sumeru being Chapter 3 of the main Teyvat storyline. Now, I wanted to touch on the fact that Sumeru is going to be the midway point concerning the 7 nations of Teyvat, and why I think that's relevant. So the midway point of a story tends to be the part where they have certain lore reveals that changes how we see the story going forward. We know that Sumeru values knowledge and wisdom over everything else, and that whatever truths they hold in Sumeru academia are almost seen as a form of currency. Knowledge itself is value to them, and something Dainslef said in the story preview.
The god of wisdom's enemy is wisdom itself. And the oasis of knowledge is a mirage in the desert of ignorance. In the city of scholars, there is a push for folly, yet the god of wisdom makes no argument against it.
Now that leads me to this. The fact that Sumeru shares its name with Sue's bubble universe, the seed of Sumeru. I don't think that the country that values wisdom above all else in a world in which some people actually do know the truth of the world is a coincidence. I refuse to believe that. I think that Sumeru is where we're going to get the most info on the truth of the world until the near end of the story. And the last thing I wanted to cover, and there's a lot more you can dig into if you really want to, it's out there. There's plenty of people who've dug into this stuff, and not just me, but that's up to you, is Dainslef's arm. Now, we don't know what Dainslef's power is, and his vision has been kept a mystery, especially considering that when they did reveal his vision, it was just a bunch of symbols that nobody could really properly decipher. I have a bit of a crack theory on what that might actually be. Recently, in Honkai Impact 3rd, there was a character who had a form of corruption that was similar to the corruption that appears on Dainslef's arm. This character's corruption was from the overuse of the Void Archives that I mentioned earlier. That being his arm was covered in black and had gold lines running through it. It was shining. The more he used the power, the more it spread on his body. Now, what I'm suggesting is that Dainslef's power is actually that of Honkai corruption. And the reason I think this is because his is shining a dim blue light. Now, that can match up to one of two things. The first being just regular Honkai corruption, because regular Honkai corruption appears usually either pink, purple, or blue, or also matches up with the color of the current era's Herrschers of Reason Core, that being the light blue color. And the final thing that I think suggests that his power actually is Honkai energy is...
Some say a few are chosen and the rest are dregs. But I say we humans have our humanity. We will defy this world with a power from beyond.
And yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you got what you wanted out of this video, that's great. Eponia's not the welcome moon girl. Shut up. And see you later.